March 15, 2019, Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Danny Kellerman collapsed behind Conan's desk at 11:47 p.m., needle still in his arm, foam at his mouth. Conan O'Brien had 30 seconds before the cameras rolled back from commercial. 30 seconds to decide, call 911 and watch his career explode, or drag Danny to the green room and pretend it never happened. He chose silence. What happened next destroyed everything Conan had built over 3 decades. NBC fired him within a week. His wife left him within a month. His daughter stopped taking his calls. But someone else was in that studio that night. Someone with a camera. Someone who's been waiting 4 years to collect. The night Danny Kellerman overdosed. The night Conan O'Brien learned that some secrets never stay buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The green room smelled like death and disinfectant. Conan's hands shook as he pressed his fingers against Danny's neck, searching for a pulse that barely registered as a whisper. The actor's skin had turned the color of old newspaper, his lips tinged blue beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Behind them, the studio audience's laughter echoed through the walls. Canned applause for a show that had just become a crime scene. "Jesus, Danny, what did you take?" Conan whispered. But the only answer was the wet rattle in the actor's chest. He should have called 911 immediately, should have screamed for the paramedics, for anyone with medical training, for help. Instead, he found himself calculating how long until someone came looking, how long until the network executives started asking questions, how long until 30 years of building his reputation crumbled into tabloid headlines and criminal investigations. Danny's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Conan?" His voice came out as a croak. The tape." "Shut up. Don't talk." Conan grabbed a towel from the craft services table, wiping the foam from Danny's mouth. "You're going to be fine. We're going to figure this out." But even as he said it, Conan knew they were both drowning. Danny had been a mess for years, a once promising actor reduced to hawking energy drinks in late-night commercials and trading on decades-old fame. Tonight was supposed to be his comeback attempt, a chance to promote some low-budget thriller that would probably go straight to streaming. Instead, he'd shown up high, rambling about conspiracy theories and government cover-ups during the pre-interview. Conan should have canceled the segment then, should have trusted his instincts when Danny started sweating through his makeup, when his pupils dilated to pinpricks, when he kept muttering about them watching from the shadows. The camera. Danny's hand gripped Conan's wrist with surprising strength. They were recording. What camera? "Danny, stay with me." But the actor's eyes had rolled back, his breathing shallow and erratic. Conan pressed his ear to Danny's chest, listening to a heartbeat that sounded like a broken metronome. Every instinct screamed at him to call for help, to do the right thing, to save this broken man's life even if it meant destroying his own career. Then, he heard footsteps in the corridor. 30 seconds to air, Mr. O'Brien." The stage manager's voice carried through the door, cheerful and oblivious. Conan stared down at Danny's unconscious form, time crystallizing around him like amber. In 30 seconds, he would have to walk back onto that stage, deliver his monologue, interview the backup guest they'd hastily pulled from the green room roster. He would have to smile and joke and pretend that a man wasn't dying 15 feet away from where America ate their late-night entertainment. The footsteps passed by the door without stopping. Conan made his choice. He dragged Danny to the couch in the corner, positioning him to look like he was sleeping off a bender rather than fighting for his life. He straightened the actor's tie, closed his eyes, arranged his hands peacefully across his chest. From a distance, in the dim lighting, Danny looked almost serene. "I'll come back," Conan whispered. "After the show, I'll get you help then." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Danny was beyond help, beyond saving, beyond anything but the slow countdown to whatever waited on the other side of consciousness. But Conan told himself the lie anyway, because the alternative was admitting that he was choosing his career over a human life. He washed his hands in the green room sink, watching pink-tinged water swirl down the drain. In the mirror, his reflection looked like a stranger, someone capable of things the real Conan O'Brien would never do. Someone who could step over a dying man to deliver a punchline. Mr. O'Brien? Places, please. Conan straightened his tie, ran his fingers through his hair, and summoned the smile that had made him millions. When he pushed through the green room door, he left Danny Kellerman to die alone in the dark. The show went flawlessly. His monologue killed. The backup guest, some cookbook author with a nervous laugh, charmed the audience with stories about celebrity dinner parties. Conan was brilliant, magnetic. Everything NBC paid him to be. Danny was pronounced dead at 1:23 a.m., 40 minutes after the show wrapped. The official cause was listed as accidental overdose, another cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing prescription medications with alcohol. The network buried the story, the police asked perfunctory questions, and the world moved on. But someone had been watching. Someone had recorded every moment of Conan's choice, every second of his betrayal. Someone who understood that the real story wasn't Danny Kellerman's death. It was Conan O'Brien's willingness to let it happen. 3 years later, that someone was finally ready to collect. The reckoning had a name, and it was coming for him. 3 years after Danny Kellerman's death, Conan Riley sat in a converted storage closet that KPDX-FM generously called Studio B, watching rain streak down a window barely larger than a shoebox. The view consisted entirely of the dumpster behind Chang's Golden Dragon and a narrow slice of Portland's perpetually gray sky. It was 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and he was talking to an audience of maybe 12 people about traffic patterns on the 405. "And that's why you should probably avoid the Morrison Bridge for the next hour," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying none of the warmth that had once made him a household name. "This is Conan Riley on KPDX, where the music's loud and the advice is questionable." He clicked off his mic and leaned back in the donated office chair that squeaked with every movement. The studio smelled like old coffee and industrial carpet, nothing like the pristine sets he'd once commanded. No audience, no band, no celebrity guest trading rehearsed anecdotes for publicity. Just him, a board full of blinking lights he still didn't fully understand, and the constant hum of fluorescent bulbs that reminded him too much of that night. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Dad, can we try dinner again this weekend? I know last time was weird, but..." Conan stared at the message until the screen went dark. Last time had been more than weird. It had been a disaster. Sarah, now 26 and working as a nurse practitioner in Seattle, had driven down to Portland with what he'd recognized as carefully managed hope. She'd chosen a restaurant in the Pearl District, somewhere nice enough to suggest she still believed her father was worth the effort, but casual enough that they could escape quickly if things went south. They'd made it exactly 43 minutes before she asked the question he'd been dreading. "What really happened, Dad? I mean, what really happened? Because the man who raised me wouldn't just..." She gestured helplessly, her words trailing off into the silence that had been growing between them for 3 years. Conan had ordered another drink instead of answering. Sarah had paid the check and driven back to Seattle that same night. Now he typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on, "I'd like that. Let me know when and where." The studio door opened with a bang that made him jump. Marcus Chen, the station manager, poked his head in wearing the expression of someone delivering news that would probably ruin both their days. "Your 4 o'clock's here," Marcus said. "Early for once. Also still looks like he's been living in his car." Danny Kellerman. The name hit Conan like ice water in his veins. For a moment the studio tilted sideways, reality blurring at the edges. But no, this was someone else, some other broken actor trading on past glory. Danny was dead. Danny had been dead for 3 years, cold in the ground while Conan's life collapsed in slow motion. "What's his name again?" Conan asked, though he'd written it down twice. "Tommy something. Says he knew you from the old days." Marcus stepped fully into the room, lowering his voice. "Look, I know this podcast thing isn't exactly what you had in mind when you took the gig, but the numbers are actually decent. People like hearing you talk to has-beens and never-wears. Makes them feel better about their own lives. Inspiring," Conan muttered. "Hey, at least you're not doing drive-time traffic reports anymore." Marcus left, and Conan found himself alone with the familiar weight of dread settling into his chest. These interviews were the worst part of the job, sitting across from actors and comedians and writers whose careers had imploded for various reasons. all of them desperate for any platform that might remind the world they still existed. Most of them were harmless, just sad and eager to talk about better days. But sometimes one of them looked at him with recognition that went deeper than professional courtesy. Sometimes they remembered who he used to be, what he used to represent, and their eyes would fill with questions he couldn't answer. Conan pulled up his notes on the laptop that had been obsolete when the Clinton administration ended. Tommy Kellerman, 47, character actor with a string of small parts in forgettable movies. The name should have been a red flag, but Portland was full of people with names that almost belonged to someone famous. Outside, the rain was getting heavier, drumming against the window like impatient fingers. The traffic report he'd just delivered was already obsolete. The whole city would be underwater within the hour, and everyone would blame each other for not knowing how to drive in weather that arrived like clockwork 11 months of the year. His phone buzzed again. Another text, this one from an unknown number, looking forward to our conversation. I have so much to tell you about what really happened that night. Conan stared at the message until his eyes watered. The words blurred together, but their meaning remained crystal clear, cutting through 3 years of careful distance and manufactured calm. Someone knew. Someone had always known, and they were coming for him. The phone slipped from Conan's fingers, clattering against the cheap particle board desk. The screen flickered once and went dark, but the message burned behind his eyes like a camera flash in a dark room. What really happened that night? The words wrapped around his throat like a noose. 3 years of carefully constructed distance collapsing in a single text. He grabbed the phone, scrolling back to the message, but it was gone. Not deleted, gone, as if it had never existed at all. The conversation thread showed nothing but Marcus's earlier text about the broken coffee machine and Sarah's dinner invitation. His hands shook as he checked deleted messages, spam folders, anywhere the words might be hiding. Nothing. Jesus, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the fluorescent hum. Maybe he was finally cracking. 3 years of guilt and isolation and cheap whiskey for dinner had to take their toll eventually. Maybe his mind was just serving up the punishment he'd been expecting all along, conjuring ghosts from a conscience that had never quite learned to stay quiet. The studio door burst open again, this time without warning. Marcus stood there holding a paper coffee cup and wearing an expression somewhere between irritation and concern. Your guest's getting antsy out there. Says he's been waiting for 20 minutes, which is mathematically impossible since he just walked in, but... Marcus stopped mid-sentence, studying Conan's face. Christ, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's wrong? Did you see him come in? The guy who's supposed to be on the podcast? Tommy what's-his-face? Yeah. He's in the lobby reading a 3-year-old copy of Entertainment Weekly and muttering to himself. Why? Conan opened his mouth to explain about the message, then closed it. How could he describe the feeling that someone had just walked over his grave without admitting why his grave was already dug? Nothing, just, give me 2 minutes. Marcus lingered in the doorway, clearly wanting to push for more information, but the phone in the main office started ringing with the persistence of someone who refused to accept that KPDX-FM wasn't important enough to demand immediate attention. 2 minutes, Marcus said, pointing at him with the coffee cup. Then you're going to sit across from this guy and pretend to care about whatever direct-to-DVD masterpiece he's hawking. We need the content. Alone again, Conan pulled up the contact information for Tommy Kellerman. The phone number matched the one from the vanished text. He was certain of it, even though he couldn't prove it. But Tommy Kellerman wasn't Danny Kellerman. Different person entirely. Had to be. Except the names were close enough to make his skin crawl. He forced himself to review his notes again. Tommy Kellerman, 47, appeared in a handful of low-budget thrillers and horror movies throughout the 2000s. Usually played the best friend who died in the second act, or the suspicious neighbor who turned out to be harmless. Character actor work, the kind of career that kept you working but never made you famous. The bio was thin, professionally written. The kind of generic press kit material that agents cobbled together for clients whose biggest credit was a commercial for regional furniture stores. Nothing about it suggested any connection to Danny, nothing that should have triggered the panic now clawing at Conan's chest. But the message, the timing, the name. 3 years ago, when the scandal broke and his marriage imploded and NBC quietly bought out his contract, Conan had told himself that the worst was behind him. The investigation into Danny's death had been perfunctory. A washed-up actor with a history of substance abuse dies of an accidental overdose in a network green room. Tragic, but predictable. The kind of Hollywood cautionary tale that generated sympathy for exactly one news cycle before everyone moved on to fresher disasters. No one had questioned Conan's story. He'd found Danny already unconscious, called for help immediately, stayed with him until the paramedics arrived. The timeline worked. The witnesses corroborated his account. The security footage from the hallway showed nothing suspicious, just Conan returning to his dressing room after the show, just like every other night. What the footage didn't show was the 47 minutes Conan had spent washing blood from his hands and arranging a dying man like a piece of furniture. His office door opened for the third time, but this time no one spoke. Footsteps shuffled across the industrial carpet, slow and deliberate, like someone who had all the time in the world. Conan kept his eyes on his laptop screen, afraid of what he might see if he looked up. "Hello, Conan?" The voice hit him like a physical blow. Not Tommy Kellerman's voice. Not some stranger's voice. This was a voice he'd heard begging for help in a green room that smelled like death. A voice that had whispered about tapes and cameras and secrets that were supposed to be buried with their owner. Conan looked up into the face of a dead man. Danny Kellerman sat down across from him, 3 years older and impossibly alive, smiling like they were old friends catching up over coffee. "I think," Danny said, "it's time we had that conversation." The studio air became thick as concrete. Conan's lungs refused to work properly, each breath shallow and useless. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, or maybe his hearing had become hypertuned to every sound except the impossible voice still echoing in his ears. "You're dead." The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I watched you die." Danny's smile widened, showing teeth that were yellower than Conan remembered, but undeniably real. "Did you? Or did you watch me almost die and decide it wasn't worth the inconvenience?" "This isn't real. You're not real." Conan gripped the edges of his desk, the particle board rough beneath his palms. "I'm having a breakdown, finally having the breakdown everyone expected 3 years ago. Touch me." "What?" "Touch me, Conan. Prove I'm not real." Conan recoiled as if Danny had suggested he stick his hand in a garbage disposal. The space between them, maybe 4 feet across the cramped studio, felt like an ocean he couldn't cross. Everything about Danny was wrong but familiar. The same thinning hair, now completely gray, the same nervous habit of picking at his cuticles, the same cheap cologne that couldn't quite mask the smell of cigarettes and desperation. "How are you here?" Conan's voice cracked like a teenager's. "I saw the death certificate. I saw the funeral coverage on Entertainment Tonight. You saw what they wanted you to see, what you needed to see to sleep at night." Danny leaned forward, his chair creaking in harmony with Conan's. "Tell me, how's that working out? The sleeping?" The question hit too close to home. Conan hadn't slept properly in 3 years. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Danny's face going slack, heard that terrible rattling breath, felt the weight of choosing his own survival over another man's life. "What do you want?" "Same thing I wanted 3 years ago, to tell someone the truth before it's too late." Danny's fingers drummed against his thigh in a rhythm Conan almost recognized. "But this time, I'm not dying in some network green room while you decide whether I'm worth saving. I tried to save you. I called for help. After the show." Danny's voice turned sharp. "After your precious monologue. After you made sure America got their nightly dose of Conan O'Brien charm. How long did you wait? 40 minutes? An hour?" "It was 47 minutes. The admission slipped out like a confession. I timed it. I counted every second. There it is." Danny sat back, looking almost relieved. "The truth. Jesus, do you know how long I've been waiting to hear you admit that?" The studio door was 12 feet away. Conan could see it in his peripheral vision, a rectangle of safety that might as well have been on another planet. His legs felt like they'd been filled with sand, useless and heavy. Even if he could move, where would he run? Marcus was in the main office. Other employees were scattered throughout the building. How could he explain why he was fleeing from a dead man? "The message," Conan whispered. "You sent that message." "What message?" About what really happened that night. You texted me." Danny tilted his head, genuinely confused. "I don't have your number, Conan. I don't even have a phone anymore. Hard to maintain a cellular plan when you're legally deceased." Ice water spread through Conan's veins. If Danny hadn't sent the message, then who had? Who else knew about that night? Who else had been watching, waiting, orchestrating this moment? "Then how did you find me?" "I never lost you. I've been keeping track for 3 years. Portland's not that big, and you're not exactly maintaining a low profile. Local radio host, occasional podcast appearances, that disastrous interview with the Oregonian where you looked like you wanted to crawl into a hole and die. Someone's been helping you. Now you're catching on." Danny's smile turned predatory. "Did you really think you were the only one with secrets that night? The only one with something to lose?" Before Conan could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Marcus's voice carried through the thin walls, talking to someone about advertising rates and demographic targeting. Normal office sounds from a normal day that had somehow become the most surreal moment of Conan's life. "You should answer that," Danny said, though no one had knocked. The footsteps stopped outside the studio door, 3 soft knocks, polite but insistent. "Conan?" Marcus's voice but strained. "Nervous. Your guest is here. Says you're expecting him." Conan looked at Danny, then at the door, then back at Danny. "You're already here." "No," Danny said quietly. "I'm dead, remember? Has been for 3 years. But Tommy—" He stood up, his chair rolling backward into the wall. "Tommy's very much alive, and he's been waiting a very long time to meet you." The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "He's the one who's been watching, Conan. He's the one with the cameras." Conan's hand moved toward the door handle as if controlled by someone else. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, the weight of 3 years pressing down on his shoulders. Danny remained standing beside the chair, watching with the detached interest of someone observing a laboratory experiment. "Don't," Conan whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to himself or to the ghost that shouldn't exist. "You have to," Danny replied. "You've been running from this conversation for 3 years. Time's up." The door handle turned before Conan could reach it. Marcus stepped inside, followed by a man who looked like Danny's reflection in a funhouse mirror. Similar features stretched and distorted, familiar but wrong. Tommy Kellerman was taller, broader, with the kind of gym-enhanced physique that suggested someone fighting desperately against middle age. But the eyes were identical, dark, calculating, and filled with a hunger that made Conan's skin crawl. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Marcus said, oblivious to the fact that there were now 2 impossible people in a room barely large enough for one. "This is Tommy Kellerman. Tommy, meet Conan Riley." Tommy's handshake lasted too long, his grip just shy of painful. "Such an honor," he said, his voice a lower register version of Danny's. "I've been looking forward to this for years." Marcus glanced around the studio, and for a moment Conan thought he might see Danny standing there, might acknowledge the impossibility of the situation. Instead, Marcus just frowned at the extra chair. "Didn't realize you'd rearrange the furniture. Anyway, you've got about 40 minutes before the 5 o'clock traffic update. I'll be in my office if you need anything." The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid. "Brothers," Danny said, settling back into his chair as if he belonged there. "Twins, actually. Identical in all the ways that matter." Tommy sat down across from Conan, his movements a perfect mirror of Danny's 3 years earlier. The same nervous energy, the same way of claiming space in a room. "Danny told me so much about you before he died. How helpful you were that night. How understanding. I don't understand any of this." Conan's voice sounded hollow even to himself. "Danny's dead. I was at his funeral." "Closed casket," Tommy said with a smile that belonged in a horror movie. Amazing how cooperative funeral directors can be when you're paying cash and asking the right questions, or when you know exactly which security footage they'd prefer never saw the light of day. The room tilted sideways. Conan gripped his desk harder, knuckles white against the fake wood grain. "You switched places." "Sometimes." Danny stretched his legs out, completely at ease. "Tommy had the acting career, I had the drug problem. When I overdosed in your green room, Tommy saw an opportunity, a fresh start for both of us." I died that night, Tommy continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a rehearsed speech. Tommy Kellerman, failed character actor, officially ceased to exist, and Danny got a second chance at life, assuming he could stay clean and keep his mouth shut. But Danny always was a talker, Danny added, his tone almost fond, couldn't help himself, always had to share the interesting stories. Conan felt like he was drowning in their words, each revelation pulling him deeper underwater. The death certificate, the investigation. Money talks, Tommy said. Amazing how quickly paperwork can be filed when the right people are motivated to move on from an embarrassing situation. A washed-up actor overdoses at NBC? Bad publicity for everyone involved. Much better to file the reports quickly and let everyone forget. Including you. Danny's voice turned harder. You were so grateful to avoid the scandal, so relieved that the man who almost destroyed your career was finally gone for good. You never questioned the details, did you? The truth of it hit Conan like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on protecting himself, on managing the damage to his own reputation, that he'd never looked closely at Danny's death. The closed casket funeral, the rushed investigation, the network's immediate pivot to damage control, all of it had served his interests perfectly. He'd never wanted to dig deeper. What do you want? The question came out as a whisper. Recognition, Tommy said. Acknowledgement of what really happened that night. Justice, Danny added, for the man who left me to die. But you didn't die. No, Danny smiled, and this time there was nothing predatory about it. Just sadness that stretched back 3 years. But you did. The Conan Riley who might have saved me, who might have chosen differently, he died that night. What's sitting across from me now is just the shell. Tommy reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital camera, the kind that had been obsolete when smartphones took over. 3 years of footage, he said, setting it gently on the desk between them. 3 years of watching you pretend to live with what you did. Every sleepless night, every failed dinner with your daughter, every moment you've spent dying a little more inside. The question is, Danny said, leaning forward, what are you willing to do to make it stop? Conan stared at the camera, its black lens reflecting the fluorescent lights like a dead eye. The weight of 3 years collapsed into this single moment. Every sleepless night, every avoided phone call from Sarah, every drink that failed to wash away the taste of guilt. You want money. It wasn't a question. Tommy laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the small space. Money? Conan, you're working at a radio station that advertises bail bondsmen and used car lots. What money? Then what? We want you to remember, Danny said softly. That night in the green room, when you found me choking on my own vomit, you stood there for 47 minutes, watching me die, calculating the damage to your precious career. I was in shock. Bullshit. Tommy's voice cracked like a whip. You were in control. You made a choice. You decided my brother's life was worth less than your ratings. The memory rushed back with crystalline clarity. Danny convulsing on the green room floor, foam at the corners of his mouth, his skin turning the color of old newspaper. And Conan standing in the doorway, phone in his hand, thinking about the headlines, thinking about his contract, renewal, thinking about anything except the dying man at his feet. I saved you, Conan whispered. Eventually, I called for help. After you made sure the show wrapped cleanly, after you coached the paramedics on the story, after you sanitized the scene. Danny leaned forward, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been rage. Do you know what 47 minutes feels like when you're drowning in your own blood? You survived. I survived because I'm too stubborn to die on schedule. But you didn't know that when you left me there. Tommy picked up the camera, turning it over in his hands like a prayer book. This little device has been recording your life for 3 years. Every moment of misery, every failed relationship, every time you've looked in the mirror and seen a killer staring back. I'm not a killer. No? Danny tilted his head. What do you call someone who watches another person die and chooses not to help? The words hung in the air like smoke. Conan felt something breaking inside his chest, a sound like old wood splintering. What do you want me to do? Confess? Destroy what's left of my career over something that happened 3 years ago to someone who didn't even die? There it is. Tommy's smile was triumphant, predatory. The real Conan Riley, still calculating the cost, still protecting yourself first. I have a daughter. I have people who depend on... Sarah hasn't spoken to you in 6 months. Danny's voice was gentle, almost kind. Your ex-wife changes the subject when people mention your name. The only people who depend on you are the advertisers who need someone desperate enough to hawk their products on a failing radio station. The truth of it was devastating. Conan thought of his last conversation with Sarah, stilted and awkward over lunch at a downtown restaurant she'd chosen because it was public, neutral, impossible to have the kind of breakdown that seemed to follow him everywhere. She'd looked at him like he was a stranger wearing her father's face. You destroyed everything good in your life to protect a secret that wasn't even worth protecting, Tommy continued. Because the secret wasn't what you did that night. The secret was who you really are. Stop. A coward, Danny said. A man who values his own comfort more than human life. You didn't become that person in my green room, Conan. You just finally showed your true face. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, counting seconds like a metronome. Somewhere in the building, Marcus was probably wondering why the interview was taking so long, why there was no sound of conversation coming from the studio. In a few hours, Conan would have to go home to his empty apartment, pour himself 3 fingers of whiskey, and pretend that this conversation had never happened. I know what you're thinking, Tommy said, standing up slowly. You're wondering if you can make this go away. Buy us off, threaten us, maybe even call the police and claim harassment. But here's what you're missing, Danny added, rising from his chair like smoke. We're not here for revenge. We're not here to destroy you. We're here to save you, Tommy said, and for the first time his voice carried something that might have been compassion. Because the man who's been dying slowly for 3 years isn't the villain in this story. Conan looked up at both of them, these impossible brothers who had orchestrated his downfall and now claimed to offer salvation. What are you talking about? Tommy smiled, but this time it was Danny's sad, knowing expression reflected in his twin's face. We're talking about the person who actually killed my brother that night, the one who's been pulling the strings ever since, making sure you took the fall for their crime. Someone else was in that green room, Conan, someone who wanted Danny dead, and you were just the perfect patsy. The words hit Conan like ice water. He felt the ground shifting beneath him. Everything he'd believed about that night crumbling into dust. That's impossible. I was there. I saw what happened. You saw what they wanted you to see. Tommy reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a manila envelope, thick with papers. Tell me, Conan, what do you remember about the 40 minutes before you found Danny? The question caught him off guard. He'd replayed the discovery so many times that the moments before had blurred into background noise. I was in my dressing room, going over notes for the monologue. Alone? Yes. No, wait. The memory surfaced slowly, like something rising from deep water. Someone knocked, said they needed to check the ventilation system. Danny and Tommy exchanged a look. Who? I don't remember. Maintenance, I assumed. They had a uniform, a clipboard. Conan pressed his palms against his temples, trying to force the details back into focus. They were in there for maybe 10 minutes. Said something about carbon monoxide levels in the older parts of the building. And then nothing. They left. I finished my notes and went to check on Danny before the show. The memory crystallized with horrible clarity. He was already unconscious when I found him, already turning blue. Tommy opened the envelope and spread photographs across the desk. Security camera stills, grainy and time-stamped. These are from that night. Notice anything interesting? Conan studied the images. They showed the hallway outside the green rooms, himself walking toward Danny's door, standing frozen in the doorway for what looked like an eternity. But in the background of one photo, barely visible, was a figure in a maintenance uniform walking away from the camera. The ventilation story was a cover, Danny said quietly. Someone needed access to my green room before you found me. Someone who knew exactly when you'd check on me, who could count on you freezing when you saw what they'd done. This is insane. You're saying someone poisoned you? Not poisoned. Triggered. Tommy pulled out another photo, this one showing Danny accepting a bottle of water from someone off camera. I'd been clean for 6 months before that taping, longest I'd ever managed. But sobriety doesn't mean the addiction goes away. It just means you're fighting it every day. Someone slipped you something? Fentanyl-laced pills, dissolved in water, enough to cause an overdose but timed to hit during the show taping. They needed you to find me in distress, needed you to make the choice to protect yourself instead of calling for help immediately. Danny's voice was steady, matter-of-fact, but his hands were shaking. What they didn't count on was my tolerance being higher than they calculated. I should have died. The plan required me to die. Conan felt the world tilting sideways. But why? Why would someone want to kill you? Wrong question, Tommy said. The question is, why would someone want to destroy you? The implications crashed over Conan like a wave. If someone had orchestrated Danny's overdose, if they'd counted on his moral failure, then everything that followed, the scandal, the exile, the slow destruction of his life, had been planned, deliberate. Who? The word came out as a whisper. Someone with access to the building. Someone who knew your routine, your schedule, your psychology well enough to predict exactly how you'd react. Tommy gathered the photos back into the envelope. Someone who's been watching you self-destruct for 3 years, making sure you never look too closely at what really happened. Think, Conan, Danny urged. Who knew you well enough to know you'd choose self-preservation over doing the right thing? Who had the most to gain from your downfall? Conan's mind raced through the possibilities. Network executives who'd wanted him gone. Rival hosts who'd coveted his time slot. Agents who'd felt slighted by contract negotiations. But none of it felt right. The level of planning, the intimate knowledge of his character, the patience to orchestrate a 3-year destruction. It suggested someone closer. They're still watching, Tommy said, standing and moving toward the window. Still pulling strings. Do you think it's a coincidence that Danny showed up today, when you're at your lowest point? When you're finally ready to hear the truth? Someone wanted this conversation to happen, Danny added. Wanted you to learn the truth at exactly the right moment. The question is whether they're planning to let you live long enough to do something about it. As if summoned by his words, Conan's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number, now you know. But knowing and proving are different things. You have 48 hours to decide whose story the world believes. Choose carefully. Tommy looked at the message over Conan's shoulder and smiled grimly. There's our puppet master. And now the real game begins. The studio door burst open before any of them could react. Marcus stood in the doorway, his usual affable demeanor replaced by something cold and calculating. In his hand was a small device, a signal jammer, Conan realized with sick clarity. 48 hours seemed generous, Marcus said, stepping inside and locking the door behind him. But then again, I always was too sentimental for this business. The pieces fell into place with devastating precision. Marcus, who'd given him this job when no one else would. Marcus, who knew every detail of his schedule, his psychology, his breaking points. Marcus, who'd been there at NBC that night, ostensibly to coordinate with the radio division about cross-promotion opportunities. It was you. Conan's voice came out flat, emotionless. The betrayal was so complete it felt like falling through space. You killed Danny, or tried to. I saved your career, Marcus corrected, settling into the chair behind Conan's desk as if he owned it. For 3 years. Gave you a soft landing when you should have been destroyed completely. You have no idea how much work it took to keep you breathing after that night. Danny stepped forward, and for the first time since this nightmare began, his face showed real rage. You poisoned me, left me to die on that floor. You were killing yourself anyway. Slower, messier, but the outcome was inevitable. Marcus's tone was conversational, almost friendly. I just expedited the process while creating an opportunity. Conan needed to fall. The network wanted fresh blood in late night. But a simple contract non-renewal would have left him with his dignity intact. No, we needed something that would crater his reputation completely. Why? The question tore from Conan's throat. I trusted you. I thought you were my friend. You were a relic. 30 years of the same tired jokes, the same predictable format. Television was evolving, and you were anchor weight. Marcus leaned back in Conan's chair, perfectly at ease. But you had enough allies, enough history with the network that removing you required finesse. Scandal was the only option. Tommy moved toward the door, but Marcus raised his other hand, revealing a gun. Small, professional, the kind of weapon that suggested this wasn't his first time orchestrating someone's destruction. I wouldn't. We're going to finish this conversation properly. The plan was elegant, Marcus continued. Danny overdoses during your show. You panic, choose self-preservation over human decency, and the footage of your delay in calling for help destroys your career permanently. Clean, simple, effective. Except Danny survived. A miscalculation. His tolerance was higher than anticipated. But it worked out better this way. A dead body would have brought police attention we couldn't control. A damaged actor with a drug problem was just an unfortunate incident everyone wanted to forget. Conan felt something hardening inside his chest, crystallizing like water turning to ice. 3 years of guilt, 3 years of self-destruction, 3 years of believing he was the monster in this story. You've been watching me, recording me, quality control, making sure you stayed properly broken. Can't have you recovering your confidence, asking inconvenient questions. The radio station position, the apartment lease, even some of your daughter's scheduling conflicts. I've been managing your decline very carefully. Sarah. The name came out as a whisper. The lunch dates that got canceled, the phone calls that went unanswered, the growing distance between them that he'd attributed to his own failures. She loves you, you know. Would have forgiven you anything, given enough time and space to heal. But every time you got close to reconciling, something would come up. Work obligations, family emergencies, miscommunications. Marcus smiled with genuine satisfaction. Amazing how fragile relationships become when you apply the right pressure at precisely the right moments. The rage that had been building in Conan's chest finally found its voice. He stood slowly, deliberately, his hands steady for the first time in years. You destroyed my family, my life. For what? A time slot? For evolution, for progress, for the good of the industry. Marcus kept the gun trained on them, but something in his posture suggested he was enjoying this revelation. Your replacement brought in younger demographics, fresh energy. The network's late-night revenue increased 40% in the first year, and you got your promotion. Executive Vice President of Strategic Development. Yes, it's been a very successful 3 years. Marcus checked his watch with theatrical precision. Which brings us to our current situation. You know too much, and I've grown tired of managing your rehabilitation. It's time to close this chapter permanently. Danny stepped protectively in front of Tommy, and Conan realized with sudden clarity that these broken brothers had become something like family to him. 3 years too late, he was finally ready to choose someone else's welfare over his own. No, Conan said, moving to stand beside them. This ends now. Marcus's smile faded as he saw something new in Conan's face, something that had been missing for 3 years. You're in no position to negotiate. Maybe not, Conan replied, his finger hovering over the emergency broadcast button that would send their conversation live to every radio in Portland. But I'm done being your puppet. He pressed the button, and the red recording light blazed to life. The red light blazed like a small sun in the dimly lit studio. Across Portland, radios crackled to life with the sound of Marcus's sharp intake of breath, the scrape of his chair as he lunged for the broadcast controls. Ladies and gentlemen, Conan said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years behind a microphone. My name is Conan Riley, and I have a story to tell you. Marcus raised the gun, his composure finally cracking. Turn it off, now. 3 years ago, I watched a man nearly die and chose my career over his life. Conan kept talking, his eyes locked on Marcus while his voice carried across the airwaves. I thought that made me the villain in this story. I was wrong. The next 23 minutes unfolded like a fever dream. Marcus screaming threats, while Danny calmly recounted the night he was poisoned. Tommy describing 3 years of surveillance, manipulation, the systematic destruction of Conan's relationships. Conan himself finally speaking the truth he'd carried like a stone in his chest. Not just about his failures, but about the man who'd orchestrated them all. By the time police sirens began wailing in the distance, summoned by emergency calls from listeners who'd heard Marcus threaten to kill them on live radio, the gun was on the floor and Marcus was sitting in the corner staring at nothing. The weight of his own words, broadcast to a city that now knew exactly what he'd done, seemed to have broken something fundamental inside him. 6 months later, the Portland coffee shop was nothing special. Mismatched chairs, local art on the walls, the kind of place that survived on conversation rather than atmosphere. Conan sat by the window, watching autumn rain streak the glass, waiting. Sarah arrived first, shaking droplets from her coat, her smile tentative but real. She'd started calling again after the broadcast, slowly rebuilding the bridge her father's guilt and Marcus's manipulation had burned. The conversations were careful, deliberate, but they were conversations. It was enough. Danny appeared in the doorway like a ghost learning to be solid again. 6 months clean, his face had filled out, his eyes clear in a way Conan hadn't seen since before that terrible night. Tommy followed a step behind, protective as always, but the predatory edge had softened into something almost resembling peace. They settled around the small table, 4 people bound together by trauma and the slow work of healing. Outside, Portland went about its business, largely unaware that the local radio host who'd confessed to moral cowardice on live radio was having coffee with the people he'd wronged. The book deal came through, Sarah said, stirring sugar into her latte. She was writing about the case, about manipulation and media and the stories people tell themselves to justify unforgivable things. Publishers had been circling since the trial. Good, Conan said, and meant it. His daughter had found her voice in his destruction, learned to see clearly in a way his own guilt had never allowed. You'll tell it better than I could. Danny laughed, a sound that still surprised all of them. You told it pretty well that night. I've never heard someone confess to being a coward with such eloquence. Practice, Conan replied. 3 years of talking to myself in mirrors. You develop a certain fluency in self-loathing. The conversation meandered like the rain outside. Marcus's conviction on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy, the network's settlement offer that Conan had declined, the small radio station in Seattle that had offered him a weekend shift playing jazz standards with minimal commentary. He'd accepted. The idea of talking less, letting music carry the weight of meaning, felt like resurrection. I should apologize, Tommy said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of something long considered. For the surveillance, for letting you suffer when we could have exposed Marcus earlier. Conan shook his head. You saved my life. Maybe not the way I would have chosen, but you gave me the truth. That's worth 3 years of misery. Is it? Sarah asked, her journalist's instinct for uncomfortable questions intact. Was it worth what you lost? The answer came without hesitation. Your mother and I were already broken. The show was already dying. I was already becoming someone I didn't recognize. He looked around the table at these unlikely companions. But this, sitting here, knowing who I really am instead of who I pretended to be, this is worth everything. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the window. Somewhere across the city, Marcus sat in a cell, his own reckoning just beginning. The network had moved on to its next manufactured crisis. The world had largely forgotten the late-night host who'd confessed his sins on live radio. But in this coffee shop, surrounded by people who'd seen him at his worst and chosen forgiveness over vengeance, Conan Riley felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness. That would come slowly, earned through small acts of decency and the patient work of rebuilding trust. Peace. The kind that comes not from avoiding the truth, but from finally being brave enough to live with it. He took a sip of his coffee and watched the rain, no longer afraid of what tomorrow's broadcast might bring.